So it's great to be with you. Let me ask you this. How many of you are current small group leaders? You lead a small group. Okay, awesome. How many of you are new? This is a new thing for you. This is a new small group. This is brand new. Okay, a few of you. That's awesome. That's awesome. I'm so excited to talk to you today a little bit. Daniel gave you some of my background, but I've been at a couple amazing churches and now at Lifeway, and I get to talk about discipleship and small groups around the country and done some international things as well. In fact, this is my third weekend in a row of doing this at churches, and I'll be at different churches for the next 4 weeks doing training. So it's so much fun to kind of go around and to see what God is doing at the Big C Church around the world with small groups and discipleship, and some amazing things are happening. A lot of times I get to take my family. My wife came with me on this trip, mainly because she had to, because we were dropping our daughter off at college, but it's still good to have her on the ride. I thought I'd show you, this is my family, and this is Mother's Day this year at our church, but the one on the right there is my oldest daughter, Brianna. She's the Gamecock, so she's the one that we just dropped off. She's amazing. Then my wife in the middle, and then that's my youngest there, Ashlyn. She's 15, and you couldn't have any more opposite between the two sisters. I mean, I don't think they're from the same family. There's just no way. There's no way, but that's my family. And then that's our small group. So we just started a brand new small group. Now, I have been a part of or led small groups for the past about 21 years straight, but last year, we had kind of moved a little bit, and so we decided let's start a brand new group, and so we launched a new group. We live in basically downtown Nashville. I don't know how many are familiar with Nashville, but we live in an area called Germantown, which is just about a mile north of Broadway, which is kind of the main strip down the middle of Nashville. So we decided we want to do community with the people that kind of live in our area and around us, and obviously we're not young. We're in our 40s. We're almost empty nesters, but we decided to open up whoever wants to sign up for our group. So we opened it up for the church, and we ended up with millennials and one old guy. I'm just kidding. They're our neighbor. His wife wasn't there. We invited them. But we ended up with all 20-somethings and our neighbors and my wife and I. So God knew that we needed this season to raise up the next generation and really kind of feed into them. So it's been amazing. That was at a baseball game. I hope as small group leaders you get to do fun things, especially during the summer. So this is one of the fun things that we did. We don't meet every single week. Usually for the summer, we take a break from doing the Bible study every week. We get together, do some fun stuff. So this was at the baseball game, which is just down the street from our house, and we got together. There's a few missing. We've got about 16 that are in our small group. Our group before that we had for 7 straight years, and we launched it through our church. We decided at the time, again, to do a group for young married couples. And we had 2 reasons for doing that. One reason sounds better than the other, so I'll start with that one. Our church needed it. In the area that we were at, we had a lot of young married couples that didn't have a small group, and so we decided to start a small group for those young married couples. Here's the other reason that we didn't want to provide child care. How many of you feel that? Okay, we didn't want to provide child care, so we started a young married couples group. Now, here's the issue and the problem with doing that, okay? It's all right for the first couple of years, but what's going to happen is if you start that young married couple group, they're going to multiply. And I don't mean by multiplying small groups. They're going to have children, and then you're going to have to figure out the child care issues. So we just got rid of that group and got this group. That's how we moved on from that, but just kidding. We did other things. But I love small groups. I've been a part, again, of a small group and leading a small group for several years. But I got to be a little honest with you at the beginning. I didn't always love small groups. In fact, when I started this journey on kind of being on a church staff 24 years ago, I didn't want to have anything to do with a small group. I didn't want this at all. I'm an introvert by nature. If you read my book, Small Groups for the Rest of Us, which Daniel had, I talk about that a lot. I'm an introvert. At the time, I didn't know really what small groups were about. I grew up in more of a traditional Sunday school type church. My dad was a pastor, and so we had the Sunday school classes where you started out from the crumb crunchers, and then you kind of moved moved your way through the different classes until you ended up in a class sitting in the main auditorium with the senior adults. That's kind of the way it worked. So this whole small group thing, where you went to somebody's house and you told, all of your sins and your secrets and all that stuff. I didn't want anything to do with that. I just did not. Well, we ended up moving when we first got married from Houston, Texas to Charleston, South Carolina to be on staff at Seacoast. And Seacoast had small groups. They had what you guys have. They had small groups that met in homes. And I thought that was great, but I didn't want anything to do with those small groups. I thought, we'll be okay. And then a friend of ours that we had gotten to know on staff invited us to their small group. And I said, that's okay. Thanks for the invite. We're great. My wife said, yeah, we'd love to come. So we went. But I said, here's the deal. First meeting, this is a little embarrassing to talk about. This is how it went down. I said, I don't want to go to this group if it's like just us and them or one other couple, because that's way too vulnerable. I don't want to be a part of that. So what we're going to do is we're going to sit a little bit away in the car and watch the door and make sure there's enough people that come. This is terrible. This is terrible. This is how my small group life started. Did I mention that I've led a church of small groups? I write about small groups. That's what I do. This is how I started. So we parked about 2 blocks away, and with enough cars in between us, so they couldn't really tell. I'm sure the neighbors thought we were casing their house. But we sat there, and we watched, and my wife was very nice. She said, okay, I'll do that for you. And unfortunately or fortunately, people showed up to that small group. So we went in, we walked into our first small group about 21 years ago, and it completely changed my life. It changed my wife's life. It changed our life. Like I said, from then on, we have been in small groups. I thought small groups were going to be weird. Here was my mental picture of small groups. I thought that you get together, and like I said, you talk about your deepest, darkest sins and issues, and then you hold hands, you sing, and then you do a big group hug at the end. That's what I thought a small group was. Maybe that is your small group. That's okay. That's okay if you do that. That wasn't what I wanted. That wasn't the group that we walked into. So I thought small groups are weird. I found out really quickly that the only reason that small groups are weird, at least the ones that I'm in, is because I am in them. I'm the weird one. We always tell leaders, I tell leaders that you got EGRs in your group. EGR stands for Extra Grace Required. And if you don't know who they are, they're probably you. So I'm one of those. But, my accountability partners for the last 21 years have been in my small group. Our best friends in life have been in our small groups. The people that we do life with, that we pray with, that we go to church with, are in our small group. So I can't imagine doing life without my small group. And I hope that you feel that way, or you're going to feel that way kind of once you get into it. And leading a small group is an amazing task. It's an incredible thing, and it's why I talk about it and I write books about it. In fact, what we're going to talk about this morning is kind of based out of this little book that I just wrote. I don't like writing long books. I wrote one and got tired of it, so I wrote a little one for this next one. And you can read that later. Don't try to read it now. But we'll base a lot of what we've got on there. But the reason I write these books is because I think that small groups and small group leadership is critical to the life of the church. It really is. And a part of that is the culture of a small group. The culture of a small group matters. Every environment that we find ourselves in, this environment that we're here right now when we come to church, our homes, our workplaces, our schools, has a culture. Whether you realize it or not, it has a culture. Now, a culture is just kind of those unwritten laws and suppositions that we have and assumptions that we have when we go into an environment. It's there, whether we realize it or not. In this environment right now is a culture. We came in, we sit at tables, we have things to write on, there's a certain temperature, there's rain on the roof, there's all of that. There's a culture that's in this room. There's a culture in your home. My home, if you were to walk into my home, there's a certain culture. Now, just by nature, we are quiet. we're quiet people. That's just kind of who we are. So if you walked into my home, it's people have told us that. They come in and we read a lot and we do puzzles and we do talk. We're not that bad, but we're quiet. We're not loud. If we watch television, it's usually later and it's lower, and we don't fight or argue. And it's just, I have 2 girls, so it's not like it's rambunctious. It's just that's our culture. So if you walked in, you would kind of experience that. And there are certain smells in our house and the way we keep the temperature and the lights and everything. There's a culture. Now, if you walked into my sister's home, now, my sister and I were raised in the same home. We had the same parents. We have the same DNA. But if you walked into my sister's home in Savannah, Georgia, it's completely different. She has 4 boys, and they're crazy. They literally, growing up, they're all grown now, but as they were growing up, they tried to kill each other. Honestly. They had a standing appointment at the local emergency room, and I'm not kidding about that. One time, I think he was around 3 or 4 years old, Chase, who was just a terrorist when he was little, was sitting behind his brother just older than him in a car, got mad at him, pulled out a pencil, and jammed it into the back of his head. So it stuck. That's my sister's house, okay? So you walk in, and they're throwing things against the wall, and they've got a basketball bouncing, and they've got sports on the TV, and they're yelling, and it's madness, but it's their culture, and they love it, and they know it. And if I lived in there, I would kill somebody because it's just crazy. Well, you have a culture, and your small group has a culture, whether you realize it or not. There's a culture to your small group. It's that kind of underpinning that everything else rests on in your group. It's kind of like rebar. If you're familiar with rebar, if you've ever seen a building that's going up, this is basically half of Nashville right now, honestly. If you go to Nashville, they're building so many buildings. It's known as Music City. It's now known as Crane City because there's so many cranes that are building buildings. But if you go and look at a building, this is what's kind of the underpinning. So rebar is what is under everything that you see in the building. We just moved into a brand new building at Lifeway. It's in downtown Nashville, and it's a beautiful building. But as it was going up, it had the rebar, and it looked kind of like this. Now, nobody goes to a building that looks like this and goes, oh, that's beautiful. That building is, you don't admire the rebar of the building. You wait until it's done. If you go to the Lifeway building, you're like, that's a really cool building, not even thinking about the fact that there's rebar that's holding up the entire building. It's kind of under the construction it's holding up. If you didn't have the rebar, the beautiful building would implode. It would fall down. And that's exactly what we have in our small groups. We have a culture that is holding up everything that we do, how we think, how we feel, and it impacts the people that come to our small group. And what I wrote this book about was the fact that we need to have a gospel-centered culture, a gospel-centered rebar that everything in our group is kind of hanging on. So it impacts the way that we think, the way that we feel, the way that we act, the conversations that we have in our small group should be an outpouring of the gospel-centeredness that is the rebar of the culture of our group. Does that make sense? So what I'm going to talk about this morning for a little bit is just the different pieces of gospel centrality, and I'll kind of break that out a little bit as we go, that should exist in our small groups. And pretty much everything that we do as a small group is going to fall under these 5 kind of sections of gospel centrality that should be holding up our group, that should be impacting the people in our group, impacting ourselves, and eventually impacting the community around us and the world that we live in, the environment everywhere that we go should be impacted by this gospel-centeredness. So the first thing I want to talk about is something that does not come natural to me, but is gospel-centered hospitality. You guys have notes there if you want to take some notes, but I want to. This is going to be very interactive this morning. I know staying on stage and lights and all that doesn't make the picture of interactivity, but I'd love to kind of get some feedback from you guys because I had the same thought as I was kind of thinking this through, writing this little book. What is gospel hospitality? So just hospitality. When I say the word hospitality, what do you think of? Just what's that? Food? Yes. Yes, that is a person after my own heart. If you read anything I write, it usually has food somewhere in it because that's a beautiful thing. What else? Welcoming, so a welcoming atmosphere. Yeah, what else? What was that? Comfort, yes. Hospitality, you walk into somebody's house or you walk into a room and you feel comfortable. You feel like you kind of can fit there. My stepmom, my mother died when I was a teenager. My father got remarried. Our house, I knew our house. It was very comfortable. I moved out. My father got remarried, and she completely changed the house, and I suddenly walked in. I wasn't comfortable anymore. It just wasn't my house. So hospitality is definitely comfortable. So what else? I have this picture, I don't know if this is about you, but Martha Stewart. Does that make sense? So like on the cover of a glossy magazine, everything's perfect. You got the perfect cookware. You got the casserole. You got the flowers in the right place. It's just this perfect picture of when I think hospitality, that's kind of what comes to mind. And I'll be honest with you this morning, that's not me. I'm just not really good at what I picture as hospitality. That hospitality is, this welcoming atmosphere and everything you guys said. When it comes to our small group that we meet every Tuesday night, my wife is the hospitality person. She does that, all right? She kind of makes the room smell good, and she has the food going and kind of all that stuff. And I'm the tech guy, so I make sure that the video is working if we're doing a video study. I make sure the chairs are in the right place. I make sure the dog's in the other room. I'm just kind of the details where she's more of the welcoming, spirit. So as I'm thinking through gospel-centered hospitality, what does that look like? And I don't have that, but I think I have the wrong picture sometimes of what hospitality is. Hospitality, if you look through the Bible, and especially the New Testament, was very important. It was an important thing. I was just looking up scriptures, researching this little book, and I found several that the biblical writers thought were very important. 1 Peter 4:9 says, "Be hospitable to one another without complaining." So he's saying that you should be hospitable and you shouldn't gripe about it. I have a tendency to gripe a lot about, we've got to fix the house up every week. We got to, do this. This gets old. But it says, do it without complaining. Romans 12:13 says, share with the saints and their needs. Pursue hospitality. So it's not only important, but you should pursue it. Hebrews 13:2 says, don't neglect to show hospitality, for by doing this, some have welcomed angels as guests without even knowing it. So you don't even know who you're bringing in with your hospitality. In fact, it was so important that Paul listed it in the requirements for both elders and deacons. So obviously hospitality is important. But I think in my mind, in a lot of our minds, we tend to think of hospitality as kind of that single action that is to be pursued occasionally, every week Tuesday night, 7 o'clock. I know I'm going to have to be hospitable. Even though I don't want to be, I got to be hospitality. I got to display hospitality as if it's some kind of quota system. I'm going to check it off. But for Christians, for us as small group leaders and Christians, hospitality is not just an act to be performed, but it's a posture to be assumed. It's a posture to be assumed. This is interesting. When I looked up the definition of hospitality, when you go back to the original Greek word, this is fascinating to me. I don't know how many of you knew this. I didn't know this. The definition of hospitality in the Greek word is two words. It's actually love and stranger. It's interesting, isn't it? Hospitality means love and stranger. And I think this is a powerful description of what Jesus did for us. If you look at initially, Jesus showed us hospitality. When we were strangers and aliens, Jesus took us in. God took us in. When we were without a home and family, God brought us into His. And when we were without hope in the world, God adopted us as His children. It's the ultimate act of hospitality. In fact, God gave His only Son to die on a cross for us in just the mind-blowing ultimate act of hospitality when we didn't even deserve it. And God is ultimately hospitable, and therefore hospitality is a characteristic. It's built into the spiritual DNA of every one of us. All of us who have received this divine hospitality from God, we have it in us to give. And Jesus, during his life, if you look at his life, if you study the life of Jesus, he didn't have a home. He didn't have cookware. He didn't have a roast, or a casserole. He didn't have any of these, but everywhere that he went, he showed hospitality. Jesus practiced the core of hospitality, which is sacrificing something of your own to welcome others in. Everywhere that Jesus went, he sacrificed himself to welcome the people around him, even if he didn't, if they didn't look like him or think like him or act like him. He welcomed them in. Love of strangers. Love of strangers. So how can we do this in our group? How can we practically live out hospitality, which is the love of strangers? Let me give you just a few things to think about as you think about how do I display this in my small group, in my home, and I've got some notes for that. The first thing is just being open to inviting strangers in the group. Just being open to inviting strangers into the group, new people in the group. Now, let me say this is not always the case for every single group. Now, there are groups that need to be closed, that need accountability. There's recovery type groups, restorational type groups that need to be closed, that we're going to gather and we're going to gather together for this many weeks or this many months. But I think that most groups can be open to looking for that stranger, that person who needs what that group has to offer. In our group, we start out every group semester with a group covenant or a group agreement, and I'm going to talk about that a lot this morning. If you don't do that, I want to encourage you to do that. Have just a piece of paper that just kind of outlines this is who we are as a group, this is what we believe. I love the 5 purposes, having the 5 purposes on there, but also kind of putting in those things that are going to be the culture, the rebar of our group. And one of the pieces of culture for us is that we are always going to be open to somebody who needs this group. Now, that doesn't mean that we advertise every week at the church. We put on the bulletin board, come join our group. But I encourage each one of the people in our group to be missionaries, to look for people in their neighborhood, at their work, people that they know that need what we're offering. And we don't care if they go to our church. If they don't go to our church, that's great. That's awesome. If they don't go to church at all, this may be a good first step. But invite them to our group. Let them experience what it means to get hospitality, to get Christian hospitality, to have Christian people around them. So just be open to inviting strangers in the group. Second thing is remember that everything speaks. This is kind of getting into the details, but it is important. I've read about Walt Disney. I'm a big Disney fan. I don't know if you guys are. If you aren't, don't talk to me. I don't care. I love Disney. So in fact, in the last 3 years, I've been to 3 Disney parks. I've taken my daughter, my oldest daughter, she was on fall break, so we went down, and I had a thing in Orlando, so we went to Walt Disney World. And then on spring break, I had a thing in California. It's nice traveling. You can occasionally do some fun things. So I took her to the original Disneyland park out there, and it was just a blast. And I've taken my wife to another Disney park just about a year and a half ago. And what's interesting is how many of you been to Walt Disney World or Disneyland? Okay. Have you noticed that when you walk from the different worlds, the pavement changes? You guys notice that? So, Walt Disney World, if you've never been there, Disneyland has different worlds, and the pavement changes because Walt Disney wanted people to feel differently when they walked into a world. So each world is kind of a different theme, and so even down to the pavement that you're walking on feels different when you walk from world to world. Well, that's kind of how it is with our small group. When they walk into our small group, they're walking into an environment, and Walt Disney had a famous statement that everything speaks. Everything in your house speaks. The culture that you provide speaks. So is there a smiling face at the door? Is there somebody to welcome them in? Going back to that welcoming that you were talking about, is there that smiling face? Is there joy in the room? Are people laughing and talking? Is there good smells? I love when we sold our house. One of the things that the realtor told us was that to have cookies Bake cookies right before you kind of have an open house because people feel more comfortable. The smells just kind of fill up the room. So all of that. How are the chairs arranged? Are they arranged in a way that people can communicate easily and talk to each other? Is there kind of a hangout time at the beginning where we're just kind of getting to know each other and kind of doing life together before we get into the study? So all of that speaks. All of that is important when it comes to kind of having a good hospitality in your group, in your room, in your house. So just think about that. Everything speaks. Another thing is be the first to serve and the last to eat. First to serve and the last to eat. A guy named Simon Sinek is one of my favorite authors, speakers. Did a famous video for a TEDx conference called the Why, Getting to Why. Well, he wrote a book called Leaders Eat Last. Leaders Eat Last. And particularly he looked at the military and kind of the way they do things. And in the military, the leaders, the commanders, eat last after everyone else. And he said the true price of leadership is the willingness to place the needs of others above your own. Great leaders truly care about those they are privileged to lead and understand that the true cost of the leadership privilege comes at the expense of self-interest. So as leaders, as small group leaders, it's as simple as eating last. It's just basic, but in my house, we do food because food matters. It does. Food is important. It kind of sets an atmosphere. It's a culture. It's a culture of our group. But I always wait, and I eat last, even though I'd love to just jump in. I'm leading the discussion. I want to get my food, eaten and all that, but I want to just physically kind of show you guys are important. Please eat first. And it's as basic as serving, just being available physically, emotionally for your group when there's a need, when something comes up, when they need somebody, you're there to serve them first. So be the first to serve and the last to eat. And the last one is pray consistently for the group. And I'll be honest with you, this is something that I struggle with. This prayer doesn't always come easy, doesn't come first to me, and I always think, man, it's 6:30 and I haven't prayed for my group. But I need to pray consistently for the group. Extravagant hospitality begins with seeking God's favor and provision on the group members. Prayer sets the stage for those life-changing moments, life-changing conversations to happen with your group. Not just in the group time, but outside that group time, those conversations that lead to catalytic life change and conversations down the road. Pray consistently. Pray every week. I love to have just a list of my group, and when I can look at it, I just pray for them individually. So praying matters. It is a part of hospitality. So that's just some kind of basic things when you think about hospitality. I want to show you, we actually interviewed some group leaders and some church pastors on what gospel-centered hospitality means to them. And then we're going to talk about it at our tables for just a minute.
To me, to be hospitable it's not about elaborate or extravagant snacks or furnishings or bedazzled journals even. Those might be good things to do, but more important is to be people-oriented and think through what would create a welcoming and intriguing and maybe even disarming atmosphere so that real gospel work can happen. That means I'm going to have to be probably more people-oriented than task-oriented.
When I think about gospel-centered hospitality and what that looks like, I think it means opening our lives, opening our homes into an environment where people want to enter, where they don't feel like they have to set aside the mess of their life, the brokenness of their life. So I think it's just creating that environment where people are welcome and where people are loved. And when we really look at the life of Jesus, when we look at how he did that and how well he did that, he not only did that with his close friends, the disciples, but he did that with the lost world. He did that with those who were far from him, who were the outcasts. And so when I look at what does gospel-centered hospitality mean, it really just means having a stance or a posture of just receiving all who want to come in and offering the love and the grace and the goodness of who Jesus is.
What's happening is I'm inviting somebody into my life that doesn't believe yet, and they get a chance to see up close what the gospel has done in my life and my family's life in such a way that even if they don't want to believe yet, something in them can wish it were true. So I don't believe the gospel yet, but there's something beautiful here, and even if I don't believe it, I wish that it were true. And so it gives them a chance to borrow the phrase, to belong before they believe, so they can honestly figure out if they want to believe. And there's something incredibly compelling about somebody seeing the humility and grace and freedom in Christ that comes with a truly gospel-freed heart.